My hands trembled as I stared at the family group chat, watching my parents mock my engagement announcement with crying, laughing emojis. Serafina and her imaginary billionaire boyfriend? My mother had typed, followed by my father adding, "She probably hired an actor for those photos." What they did not know was that my fiancé Marcus was already driving to my cousin's engagement party, and he was bringing something that would destroy their perfect little lives forever. The family fortune they thought belonged to them. It never did. Tonight, everything would change, and they would finally understand exactly who they had been betraying all these years. Before we dive into this wild family drama, I want to know where you are watching from. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness when it comes to family betrayal? Hit that like button if you have ever felt underestimated by your own family, and subscribe because this story has more twists than a soap opera. You will not believe what my parents had been hiding from me my entire life. Growing up as Serafina Mitchell in suburban Connecticut, I had always been the black sheep of what everyone considered a successful family. My parents, Robert and Patricia Mitchell, owned a thriving real estate development company that had been building luxury homes for over 2 decades. My older brother, Tyler, worked directly under them as project manager, while my younger sister, Melody, had just graduated with a business degree and was being groomed to take over marketing. Then there was me, the middle child, who chose to become a social worker instead of joining the family empire. The family dynamic had always been clear. I was the disappointment, the one who chose passion over profit, the one who would rather help homeless families find housing than build mansions for millionaires. Every family gathering became an opportunity for subtle digs about my modest salary, my small apartment, and my apparent inability to find a suitable partner who matched their standards of success. Everything changed 8 months ago when I met Marcus Donovan at a charity fundraiser for homeless youth. He was there writing a substantial check dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. We started talking about systemic poverty, and I was impressed by his genuine understanding of housing inequality. He seemed so normal, so down to earth, that when he mentioned he worked in sustainable development, I assumed he meant something like environmental consulting. Our relationship developed naturally over coffee dates, long walks, and volunteer work together. Marcus never flaunted money or talked about his job in detail. He drove a modest Honda, lived in what he described as a quiet neighborhood, and always insisted on splitting dinner bills. The most expensive thing I ever saw him purchase was a high-quality sleeping bag for a homeless veteran we had been helping. 3 months into our relationship, I discovered the truth, accidentally. We were at his apartment when a phone call came in from someone addressing him as Mr. Donovan, CEO of Donovan Industries. I stared at him in shock as he handled what was clearly a major business decision involving millions of dollars. After he hung up, he sheepishly explained that Donovan Industries was a sustainable housing development company he had built from the ground up, and it had grown far beyond what he had ever expected. When I researched his company that night, my jaw dropped. Donovan Industries was not just successful, it was revolutionary. They specialized in affordable, eco-friendly housing developments and had contracts with major cities across the country. Marcus was not just wealthy. He was transforming the very industry my family claimed to dominate, but he was doing it ethically and sustainably. The contrast was staggering. While my family built overpriced luxury homes that displaced low-income communities, Marcus was creating beautiful, affordable housing that actually helped people. While my parents networked with wealthy clients at country club events, Marcus was working with city planners and nonprofit organizations to address housing crises. When Marcus proposed 6 months later with a stunning but understated ring, I was over the moon. We had talked extensively about our shared values, our commitment to social justice, and our plans to use our combined resources to make a real difference in the world. The proposal was perfect, intimate, and everything I had ever wanted. Naturally, I called my family immediately to share the wonderful news. The response was not what I had hoped for. My mother laughed outright when I told her about Marcus, assuming I was exaggerating about his success. My father made jokes about me finally finding someone willing to date a social worker. When I mentioned that Marcus owned a development company, Tyler scoffed and said there was no way a legitimate developer would be serious about someone in my income bracket. The mockery intensified when I shared photos of Marcus and our engagement ring. My sister Melody posted the picture in the family group chat with the caption, "Serafina is really committing to this fantasy." My mother responded with concern that I might be getting catfished by someone pretending to be successful. My father suggested that Marcus was probably married to someone else and using me as a cover story. The breaking point came when my cousin Rachel announced her engagement and began planning an elaborate celebration. During the family planning discussions, my parents made it clear that they expected me to attend alone since everyone knew my relationship was not real anyway. They actually told other family members not to bother asking about Marcus because I had a tendency toward dramatic exaggeration. The humiliation was complete when my aunt called me privately to express concern that I might be having a psychological episode, creating elaborate fantasies about a perfect boyfriend to compensate for my career disappointment. The entire extended family had been discussing my apparent delusions, and everyone agreed that the kindest approach was to play along until I came to my senses. What made their dismissal even more painful was discovering the real reason behind their skepticism. During a heated phone argument with my mother about Marcus, she let something slip that changed everything. She mentioned that anyone truly successful in real estate would know about the Mitchell family reputation. And since Marcus had never contacted them professionally, he obviously could not be legitimate. That comment sparked a realization that sent chills down my spine. I began to wonder what exactly the Mitchell family reputation entailed. If my family was as successful and well-known in the industry as they claimed, why had Marcus never heard of them? His company worked with developers across the region, yet he had never mentioned recognizing my last name or knowing about my family's business. That night, I started digging into my family's business practices with the same investigative skills I used in social work. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The Mitchell Development Company had a pattern of acquiring land through questionable means, often targeting low-income communities and using legal loopholes to force residents out of their homes. They had been investigated multiple times for environmental violations, labor law violations, and predatory business practices. The deeper I dug, the more horrified I became. My family was not just building luxury homes, they were actively contributing to the housing crisis that I spent my career trying to solve. Every family vacation, every private school tuition payment, every luxury item in my childhood home had been funded by practices that displaced vulnerable families and destroyed communities. The final piece of the puzzle came when I cross-referenced my family's recent projects with a list of communities that Marcus's nonprofit partners were working to help. The correlation was undeniable. My family was creating the very problems that my fiancé was dedicating his life to solving. Armed with this devastating knowledge, I knew I had to make a choice. I could confront my family privately and hope they would change their ways, or I could find a way to expose their practices while protecting the communities they were targeting. The decision became easier when I discovered that their next major project would displace over 200 families from a historically Black neighborhood that had been fighting gentrification for years. I decided to share my findings with Marcus, knowing that his reaction would determine our future together. When I showed him the documentation I had compiled about my family's business practices, his face went through a range of emotions: shock, disappointment, and finally grim determination. "Serafina," he said carefully, "I need you to know that Donovan Industries has been fighting your family's projects for the past 3 years. We have been working with legal aid organizations and community groups to challenge their development applications." I had no idea you were related to them. The irony was staggering. The man my family dismissed as imaginary had been their primary business opposition for years. Marcus had been working tirelessly to stop exactly the kind of predatory development that had funded my entire upbringing. The universe had brought together the daughter of their biggest enemy and the man dedicated to stopping them, and neither of us had realized the connection. Marcus and I spent hours discussing the ethical implications of our situation. He assured me that my family's actions did not reflect on me personally, especially since I had chosen a career dedicated to helping the communities they harmed. However, he also made it clear that he could not, in good conscience, marry into a family that was actively working against everything he believed in unless something changed dramatically. That conversation led to a plan that would accomplish multiple goals. It would prove to my family that Marcus was real and successful, it would expose their harmful business practices, and it would give the communities they were targeting the ammunition they needed to fight back effectively. Marcus had connections throughout the sustainable development industry, including several investigative journalists who specialized in exposing predatory real estate practices. He also had relationships with legal aid organizations that could take immediate action if they had sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. What he had been missing was insider access to the Mitchell Development Company's internal documents and future plans. As someone who had grown up in the family business, I still had access to many of their files. My parents had never bothered to revoke my login credentials for their project management system, assuming that I had no interest in their work. They had also made the mistake of discussing sensitive business matters in front of me for years, never imagining that I would understand the implications or remember the details. Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully documented everything I could access legally. I photographed public records requests, compiled news articles about my family's projects, and created a timeline of community displacement that correlated with their development schedule. I also recorded several family phone calls where they discussed strategies for circumventing environmental regulations and minimizing compensation for displaced residents. The most damaging evidence came from my brother Tyler, who had been bragging about their latest acquisition strategy during a family dinner I attended. He described in detail how they had been working with a corrupt city planning official to rezone residential areas as commercial properties, allowing them to claim eminent domain and force families out of their homes at below-market prices. He was particularly proud of a technique they used to target elderly homeowners, whom they would pressure with legal threats and bureaucratic confusion until they agreed to sell for far less than their properties were worth. During that same dinner, my father made comments about certain ethnic communities being better suited for relocation, and how their displacement was actually beneficial because it encouraged urban renewal. The casual racism and complete disregard for human dignity was shocking, even though I had been hearing similar attitudes my entire life without fully understanding their implications. My sister Melody contributed her own damning evidence by showing us a marketing presentation she had created that specifically targeted wealthy buyers by emphasizing how their developments offered exclusive community environments free from undesirable elements. The presentation included before and after photos that celebrated the removal of low-income families and small businesses, treating human displacement as a selling point for luxury living. As I compiled this evidence, I felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak. These were people who had raised me, who claimed to love me, yet they were systematically destroying the lives of families just like the ones I worked with every day. Every success story they celebrated at family gatherings represented dozens of families losing their homes, their communities, and their stability. Marcus connected me with Rachel Torres, an investigative journalist who had been trying to expose predatory development practices in our region for over 2 years. When I shared my evidence with her, she was amazed at the level of detail and insider access I could provide. She had been investigating the Mitchell Development Company based on community complaints and public records, but she had never been able to prove the coordination between my family and corrupt city officials. We also brought in David Kim, a civil rights attorney, who specialized in housing discrimination and community displacement. He explained that the evidence I had gathered could support multiple legal actions, including federal civil rights violations, environmental law violations, and potential criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Rachel would publish a comprehensive exposé about predatory development practices in our region using the Mitchell Development Company as a primary case study. David would file legal challenges to their current projects and launch investigations into their past violations. Meanwhile, Marcus would work with community organizations to provide alternative housing solutions for families who had been displaced. My role would be to provide ongoing insider access and to serve as a witness if legal proceedings moved forward. However, Marcus and I agreed that the most important element of our plan was the symbolic confrontation at my cousin's engagement party. We needed my family to understand that their dismissal of my relationship had led directly to their exposure. The engagement party would serve multiple purposes. It would prove to my extended family that Marcus was real and successful. It would demonstrate that I was not delusional or attention-seeking, and it would create a public forum where the truth about my family's business practices could be revealed to our entire social network simultaneously. Marcus arranged for several key people to attend the party, as his guests, including Rachel Torres, David Kim, and Maria Santos, a community organizer who had been fighting my family's latest development project. They would arrive as normal party guests, but they would be prepared with legal documents and evidence that could be presented if the situation called for it. The week before the party, Marcus and I rehearsed our approach carefully. We would arrive together, let my family absorb the shock of his obvious success and authenticity, and then gradually introduce the conversation about business practices and community impact. If my family showed any willingness to change their approach, we would work with them privately. If they remained defiant and dismissive, we would proceed with the public exposure. The 3 days leading up to Rachel's engagement party were a whirlwind of strategic preparation and emotional turmoil. Marcus and I had assembled what could only be described as a Justice League of housing advocates, investigative professionals, and legal experts, all coordinated around the singular goal of ending my family's predatory business practices while exposing their years of dismissive behavior toward me personally. Our primary alliance consisted of 5 key players, each bringing essential skills and resources to our mission. Rachel Torres, the investigative journalist, had been working around the clock to verify every piece of evidence I had provided and to build connections with other sources who could corroborate our findings. She had discovered that the Mitchell Development Company's practices were part of a larger network of corrupt developers, city officials, and financial institutions that had been systematically displacing communities across 3 counties. David Kim, our civil rights attorney, had been equally busy preparing legal documentation that could be filed immediately if negotiations with my family proved unsuccessful. He had coordinated with federal housing authorities, environmental protection agencies, and civil rights organizations to ensure that multiple avenues of legal accountability would be pursued simultaneously. His confidence in our case was reassuring, especially since he rarely took on cases unless he was certain of victory. Maria Santos brought something equally valuable: the voices and experiences of the communities my family had harmed. As a community organizer, she had been working for years to help displaced families navigate the legal system and find alternative housing. She had documented dozens of personal stories that illustrated the human cost of predatory development, and she was prepared to share those stories if my family needed to understand the real impact of their business decisions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an urban planning professor at the local university, had joined our alliance after Marcus reached out through academic networks. Her research on sustainable development and community displacement provided crucial academic credibility to our case. She had been studying gentrification patterns in our region for her latest book, and she was eager to include the Mitchell Development Company as a case study in predatory practices. The 5th member of our alliance was perhaps the most surprising: Thomas Bradley, a former employee of my family's company, who had been fired 2 years earlier for raising concerns about their business practices. Marcus had located him through industry contacts, and his insider knowledge filled in gaps that even my access could not provide. Thomas had kept detailed records of internal communications and business decisions that he had found ethically questionable, and he was prepared to testify about the company culture that encouraged displacement and discrimination. Our strategy sessions took place at Marcus's corporate office, which provided a stark contrast to my family's approach to business. Where the Mitchell Development Company offices were decorated with luxury materials and photos of expensive properties, Donovan Industries showcased community impact photos, awards for environmental stewardship, and architectural models of affordable housing projects. The difference in values was visually obvious, and it reinforced my confidence that we were fighting for the right cause. During these planning meetings, I learned more about Marcus's background and the full scope of his business success. Donovan Industries had grown from a small sustainable construction company to a major player in ethical development with annual revenues exceeding $50 million and projects in 12 states. Marcus employed over 200 people, most of whom were committed to the company's mission of creating housing that strengthened communities rather than displacing them. The financial contrast between Marcus's ethical success and my family's predatory wealth was particularly striking. While my family measured success in profit margins and luxury acquisitions, Marcus measured success in families housed communities strengthened and environmental standards exceeded. His company had been profitable from the beginning, proving that ethical development was not only possible, but could be more sustainable than traditional approaches. As our plans solidified, the emotional weight of confronting my family became increasingly intense. Marcus was incredibly supportive, reminding me that my choice to expose their practices was an act of love both for the communities they were harming and for my family themselves, who needed to understand the consequences of their actions. However, he also made it clear that he would support whatever decision I made about our relationship, even if I ultimately chose family loyalty over justice. The night before the engagement party, I received a text message from my mother that crystallized my resolve. She had written, "Just so you know, we told everyone not to ask about your imaginary boyfriend tomorrow. We do not want you to be embarrassed when you show up alone again." The casual cruelty of that message, combined with her assumption that I would be humiliated, reminded me of every dismissive comment, every undermining remark, and every moment when my family had chosen their own comfort over my dignity. I shared the message with our alliance group, and the response was unanimously supportive. Rachel Torres smiled grimly and said, "Sometimes the best stories write themselves. Your family has created the perfect setup for their own exposure." David Kim nodded in agreement, adding, "Arrogance often precedes accountability. They have made this easier by refusing to take you seriously." Marcus held my hand as we finalized our timeline for the next day. We would arrive at the party exactly 30 minutes after the scheduled start time, allowing my family to have multiple conversations about my expected absence. Marcus would be dressed impeccably, but not ostentatiously, driving his Tesla Model S instead of his usual Honda to make his success subtly obvious. Our alliance members would arrive separately, mingling naturally with other guests, while positioning themselves strategically for the conversations that would follow. The backup plan was equally detailed. If my family proved receptive to changing their business practices, we would work with them privately to transition toward more ethical approaches. Marcus had already identified several sustainable development projects they could participate in, and David Kim had outlined legal strategies that could resolve their past violations without criminal prosecution. However, if they remained dismissive and unrepentant, we would proceed with immediate public exposure and legal action. Rachel Torres had prepared 2 different articles for publication, one that focused on industry-wide predatory practices with the Mitchell Development Company as a reformed example of positive change, and another that positioned them as the primary villain in a story of systemic community exploitation. Which version got published would depend entirely on how they responded to our confrontation. Maria Santos had coordinated with community members who were prepared to share their displacement stories with local media if necessary. She had also arranged for peaceful demonstrations outside the Mitchell Development Company offices if public pressure became necessary to force changes in their practices. Dr. Walsh had prepared academic documentation that could be shared with city planning departments and environmental agencies if formal complaints needed to be filed. Her research provided the scientific and policy framework that could support broader regulatory changes to prevent predatory development throughout the region. The most powerful element of our preparation was Thomas Bradley's willingness to go public with his insider knowledge. He had documents that could prove deliberate environmental law violations, discriminatory targeting of minority communities, and coordination with corrupt city officials. His testimony alone could trigger federal investigations that would have consequences far beyond my family's business. As I tried to sleep the night before the party, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. I had gone from being the dismissed black sheep of a successful family to being the catalyst for exposing systemic injustice and corruption. My relationship with Marcus had evolved from a simple love story to a partnership dedicated to social change. My understanding of my own family had shifted from disappointment in their values to horror at their actions. The irony was not lost on me that my family's dismissive attitude toward my life choices had led directly to their potential downfall. If they had taken me seriously, if they had respected my work, if they had bothered to learn about Marcus before mocking our relationship, they might have discovered the conflict of interest before it became impossible to resolve privately. Their arrogance and contempt had created the exact circumstances that would force them to face the consequences of their business practices. Tomorrow would determine not just the future of my relationship with my family, but the future of dozens of communities that were threatened by their development projects. The alliance we had built was prepared for every possible scenario, and I felt confident that justice would be served regardless of how my family chose to respond. The engagement party that my family expected to be a celebration of traditional success would instead become a reckoning with the true cost of their achievement. The engagement party started exactly as we had anticipated. I watched from Marcus's Tesla as my family mingled with guests, periodically checking their phones and whispering among themselves about my predictable absence. My mother had worn her most expensive dress, clearly planning to use the occasion to network and showcase the family's success. My father was holding court near the bar, telling stories about recent business victories to anyone who would listen. Our alliance members had integrated seamlessly into the party. Rachel Torres was chatting with my cousin's future in-laws about local development projects, subtly gathering additional information about community sentiment regarding my family's business practices. David Kim had struck up a conversation with several family friends who worked in city planning, positioning himself to understand the broader network of relationships that enabled my family's questionable practices. Dr. Walsh was discussing urban development trends with my uncle, who had always fancied himself an expert on real estate despite having no professional background in the field. Maria Santos had connected with several younger family members learning about their perceptions of the family business and whether any of them shared concerns about its impact on local communities. Thomas Bradley had been the most strategic in his positioning. He had approached my brother Tyler early in the evening, reintroducing himself as a former employee who was now working in sustainable development. Tyler, who had never been particularly bright about maintaining professional discretion, immediately began bragging about recent projects and sharing details about upcoming developments that could provide crucial evidence for our legal case. At exactly 7:30, Marcus and I made our entrance. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as family members processed the reality of Marcus's obvious success and sophistication. His custom-tailored suit, confident demeanor, and unmistakable aura of wealth created a cognitive dissonance that left my family momentarily speechless. My mother recovered first, rushing over with a forced smile that could not hide her shock and embarrassment. "Serafina, you look wonderful, and this must be Marcus. We have heard so much about you." Her tone was overly enthusiastic, clearly compensating for months of dismissive comments. Marcus was gracious and charming, shaking hands and making small talk while I watched my family's assumptions crumble in real time. My father kept staring at Marcus's watch, clearly recognizing expensive craftsmanship when he saw it. My sister Melody was frantically Googling something on her phone, probably trying to research Marcus's background to understand how badly she had misjudged the situation. The evening progressed beautifully for the first hour. Marcus shared carefully selected details about his business, emphasizing his commitment to sustainable development and community partnership. He spoke knowledgeably about industry trends, regulatory changes, and market dynamics, demonstrating expertise that clearly impressed my family's business-minded friends and relatives. Several family members approached me privately to apologize for doubting my relationship and to express admiration for Marcus's accomplishments. My cousin Rachel was particularly effusive, saying she had never seen me look so happy and confident. Even my normally critical grandmother admitted that Marcus seemed like exactly the kind of successful, principled man she had always hoped I would find. The turning point came when Thomas Bradley approached me during a quiet moment and requested a private conversation. We stepped onto the venue's outdoor terrace, where he delivered news that shattered my confidence completely. "Serafina, I need to tell you something that is going to be very difficult to hear." Thomas began, his expression grave. "I have been in contact with your brother Tyler for the past week, ever since our planning meetings began. He reached out to me through mutual professional contacts and offered me a substantial sum of money to provide information about your plans." My blood ran cold as Thomas continued. "Tyler knows about the investigation, the legal preparations, and the media strategy. He has been feeding information to your family's legal team, and they have been preparing countermeasures. They know about Rachel's article, David's legal filings, and Maria's community organizing efforts." The betrayal was devastating on multiple levels. Thomas had been present for every strategic discussion, privy to every piece of evidence we had compiled, and aware of every weakness in our case. He had seemed so genuine in his commitment to justice, so passionate about exposing the practices that had cost him his job and his professional reputation. "But there is more," Thomas said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Your family has not just been preparing legal defenses. They have been actively working to discredit you personally. Tyler has been spreading rumors that you are having a psychological breakdown, that your relationship with Marcus is part of an elaborate delusion, and that your accusations against the family business are motivated by jealousy and mental instability." The scope of their counterstrike was breathtaking in its cruelty. While I had been preparing to expose their business practices, they had been systematically undermining my credibility and reputation. They had turned my decision to seek justice into evidence of psychological problems, and they had used my own insider access against me by claiming I had stolen confidential information during a mental health crisis. Thomas explained that my family's legal team had prepared documentation that would portray my evidence gathering as corporate espionage motivated by personal grudges. They had psychiatric experts prepared to testify about the psychological profiles of family members who make false accusations during emotional disturbances. They had even contacted my employer to suggest that my work performance had been declining due to personal instability. The most devastating revelation was that they had been recording our family phone conversations for months, including the ones where I had expressed frustration about being dismissed and underestimated. Their lawyers planned to use those recordings to demonstrate a pattern of resentment and vindictive behavior that motivated my accusations against them. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Thomas, struggling to process the implications of his betrayal and apparent change of heart. "Because they offered me more money to sabotage tonight specifically," he replied. "They want me to create a public scene that will discredit you in front of the entire extended family. They have photographers positioned to document your reaction, and they plan to use the footage as evidence of your psychological instability." Thomas handed me a thick envelope. This contains copies of all the communications between your brother and me, including the financial payments and the specific instructions for tonight. I took their money, but I cannot go through with destroying you publicly. You deserve to know what you are walking into." As I stood on that terrace holding evidence of my family's calculated betrayal, I felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm me completely. They had not just dismissed my relationship or questioned my judgment, they had actively conspired to destroy my reputation and credibility in order to protect their corrupt business practices. The realization that my own brother had orchestrated this betrayal was particularly devastating. Tyler and I had never been close, but I had never imagined he was capable of such calculated cruelty. He had weaponized my trust, my vulnerability, and my desire for justice against me in ways that felt fundamentally evil. Marcus found me on the terrace moments later, immediately recognizing that something terrible had happened. When I showed him Thomas's documentation, his expression shifted from concern to cold fury. "They have made this personal," he said quietly. "That changes everything." What my family had not anticipated was that Marcus's success was built on more than just business acumen. It was founded on strategic thinking and comprehensive preparation that extended far beyond what they had imagined possible. Within minutes of learning about their counterstrike, Marcus was making phone calls that would demonstrate exactly why he had become one of the most respected figures in sustainable development. The first call went to Elena Rodriguez, a federal investigator who specialized in housing discrimination and civil rights violations. Marcus had been working with her department for over 2 years on a separate case involving predatory lending practices, and she had been waiting for an opportunity to investigate regional development corruption. What my family viewed as a private business dispute was actually part of a federal investigation that had been building for months. "Elena, we need to accelerate the timeline," Marcus said calmly into his phone, while I stood beside him, still reeling from Thomas's revelations. "The subjects have become aware of the investigation and are actively attempting to intimidate witnesses. We need federal protection and immediate legal intervention." The second call went to Margaret Chen, a media strategist who specialized in corporate accountability stories. While my family had been preparing to discredit me locally, Marcus had been coordinating with national media outlets that were investigating systemic corruption in real estate development. Rachel Torres's local article was just one piece of a much larger exposé that would be published simultaneously across multiple platforms. "Margaret, they are trying to get ahead of the story by attacking the source," Marcus explained. "We need to pivot to the federal evidence and the community impact documentation. Personal attacks on Serafina will only make them look more guilty when the full scope of their operations becomes public." The third call revealed the most sophisticated element of Marcus's preparation. He had been working with a nonprofit legal organization that specialized in protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. They had been monitoring the situation since I first came forward with evidence, and they had legal protections in place that my family's lawyers had never anticipated. "James, we need immediate injunctive relief," Marcus said to the attorney. "They are attempting to discredit the witness through coordinated personal attacks and employment interference. We have documentation of their strategy and evidence of bad faith legal maneuvering." Within 30 minutes, our situation had transformed completely. Federal investigators were en route to secure evidence and interview witnesses. Media outlets were preparing coordinated coverage that would reach national audiences. Legal protections were being implemented that would prevent my family from using employment or financial pressure to silence me. But Marcus's most brilliant strategic move was still to come. While my family had been focusing on discrediting me personally, they had overlooked the fact that Marcus had relationships throughout their industry that gave him access to information they never knew existed. He had been building a comprehensive case that did not depend on my insider access at all. "Serafina," Marcus said as he finished his calls, "your family made a critical mistake. They assumed that you were our only source of information about their practices. They focused all their energy on discrediting you because they thought that would destroy our entire case. But you were never the foundation of our evidence. You were just the catalyst that allowed us to organize information we already had access to. Marcus explained that Donovan Industries had been quietly documenting predatory development practices throughout the region as part of their community partnership work. They had been collaborating with displaced families' community organizations and local government agencies to understand the full scope of systematic displacement. The Mitchell Development Company had been on their radar for years, and they had been building evidence independent of any insider information. Thomas's betrayal actually helps us, Marcus continued. Now we have documented proof that your family is willing to bribe former employees, coordinate with corrupt officials, and engage in witness intimidation. That evidence of obstruction and conspiracy is often more powerful than the original business violations. As we returned to the party, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. My family's betrayal had been devastating personally, but it had also revealed the true nature of their character in ways that eliminated any remaining doubt about the righteousness of our cause. They were not just ethically misguided business people. They were actively malicious individuals who would destroy anyone who threatened their corrupt practices. The party had continued during our absence, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Our alliance members had been busy implementing the accelerated timeline that Marcus's phone calls had set in motion. Rachel Torres was conducting recorded interviews with family members and guests about their knowledge of local development practices. David Kim was serving legal notices to several individuals who had been identified as part of the corruption network. Maria Santos had connected with community members who were attending as catering staff, and she was documenting their first-hand accounts of displacement and economic hardship caused by gentrification. Dr. Walsh was photographing public documents and permits that family members had brought to show off recent project approvals. The most dramatic development came when 2 federal investigators arrived at the party, identifying themselves to my parents and requesting immediate interviews about their business practices. The timing was perfect. The entire extended family was present to witness federal law enforcement taking their business activities seriously as potential criminal matters. My father's reaction was exactly what we had hoped for. Instead of cooperating respectfully with the investigators, he became belligerent and defensive, making statements about federal overreach and regulatory harassment that were recorded and would later be used as evidence of his contempt for legal oversight. He actually threatened to use political connections to shut down the investigation, which provided additional evidence of corruption and obstruction. My mother's response was equally damaging. She immediately began blaming me for bringing federal attention to their business, claiming that I was mentally unstable and motivated by jealousy. Her public character assassination in front of investigators and extended family members demonstrated exactly the kind of witness intimidation that federal prosecutors love to include in conspiracy charges. Tyler made the situation even worse by attempting to destroy documents on his phone while investigators were present. His obvious panic and guilt made it clear that he knew their business practices were illegal, and his attempt to obstruct evidence would become a separate federal crime. The party that was supposed to celebrate my cousin's engagement had transformed into a public exposure of systematic corruption and family dysfunction. Extended family members were horrified to learn about the business practices they had been unknowingly supporting through their association with my parents. Several relatives approached me to apologize for doubting my concerns and to offer support for whatever consequences would follow. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus addressed the entire party, speaking calmly and professionally about sustainable development community partnership and the importance of ethical business practices. His obvious expertise and moral authority created a stark contrast with my family's defensive panic and obvious guilt. As federal investigators continued their work and media representatives documented the unfolding story, I realized that my family's attempt to destroy my credibility had instead provided the perfect platform for exposing their crimes to the widest possible audience. 6 months after the engagement party that changed everything, I sat in the courtroom, listening to the judge deliver sentences that would reshape not just my family's future, but the lives of hundreds of families they had displaced over the years. The federal investigation had uncovered a corruption network that extended far beyond the Mitchell Development Company, resulting in charges against city officials, bank executives, and developers across 3 counties. My father received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy fraud and civil rights violations. The judge specifically noted that his leadership role in the criminal enterprise and his attempts to intimidate witnesses demonstrated a level of callousness that demanded significant punishment. The company assets were being liquidated to provide restitution to displaced families and environmental remediation for damaged communities. My mother received 5 years for her role in the financial fraud and money laundering that had concealed the source of their illegal profits. Her attempts to discredit me during the investigation had backfired spectacularly, providing prosecutors with clear evidence of obstruction and witness intimidation that added additional charges to her case. Tyler faced 10 years for his role as the operational coordinator of the criminal enterprise. His betrayal of our investigation had been documented so thoroughly by Thomas Bradley that prosecutors were able to prove a pattern of criminal behavior that extended back over 5 years. His attempts to destroy evidence during the engagement party had been recorded by federal investigators, providing irrefutable proof of consciousness of guilt. Melody received probation and community service after cooperating fully with investigators and providing testimony about the marketing strategies that had deliberately targeted vulnerable communities. She had also agreed to use her business skills to help displaced families navigate the restitution process and find alternative housing options. The sentences were satisfying, but the broader changes that resulted from our investigation were even more meaningful. Federal housing authorities had implemented new oversight requirements for development projects in low-income communities. Environmental protection agencies had strengthened enforcement of construction regulations. Civil rights organizations had gained legal precedents that would help them challenge predatory development practices in other regions. Marcus and I had gotten married 3 months after the initial arrests, in a ceremony that celebrated not just our love, but our shared commitment to social justice and community development. The wedding was small and intimate, attended by the community organizers, legal advocates, and ethical business leaders who had become our chosen family through this experience. Our honeymoon was a working trip through communities where Donovan Industries was implementing affordable housing projects. We visited families who had been displaced by predatory developers and were now living in beautiful, sustainable homes that strengthened rather than destroyed their neighborhood networks. Every conversation reinforced our conviction that ethical development was not just possible, but more rewarding both financially and personally than exploitative practices. The most unexpected positive outcome was the transformation of my relationship with my extended family. My cousin Rachel had used her engagement party story as inspiration for a career change into investigative journalism, focusing on corporate accountability and community empowerment. Several aunts and uncles had severed business relationships with companies that engaged in predatory practices, using their experience with my parents as a wake-up call about the hidden costs of certain types of success. My grandmother, who had initially been devastated by the scandal, eventually became one of our strongest supporters. She had lived through the Great Depression and understood the importance of stable housing for family security. When she learned about the families my parents had displaced, she was horrified and insisted on contributing her own resources to the restitution fund. The community impact of our investigation extended far beyond financial restitution. Maria Santos had used the media attention to launch a regional coalition of community organizations that monitor development projects and advocate for resident protection. Dr. Walsh had published a book about sustainable development that used our case as a primary example of how communities could fight back against predatory practices. Rachel Torres had won a journalism award for her coverage of the investigation, which had exposed similar corruption networks in other regions and inspired copycat investigations across the country. Her work had demonstrated how local corruption was often part of larger systematic problems that required federal intervention and community organizing to address effectively. Thomas Bradley had become an unlikely hero in the story. His decision to document my family's bribery attempts and their witness intimidation strategies had provided crucial evidence that transformed our case from a civil matter into a criminal investigation. He had used his experience to start a consulting company that helped former employees report corporate wrongdoing safely and effectively. David Kim had leveraged his success in our case to expand his civil rights practice, taking on similar cases in other regions, and building a network of attorneys who specialized in community protection and housing justice. His legal strategies had become models for other advocates fighting predatory development practices. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation had demonstrated that individual action could create systematic change when supported by proper alliances and strategic thinking. Marcus and I had received speaking invitations from universities, community organizations, and business groups who wanted to learn about ethical development and effective advocacy strategies. Our marriage had grown stronger through the experience of fighting for justice together. We had learned that shared values were more important than shared backgrounds, and that love could flourish when both partners were committed to something larger than themselves. Marcus had shown me that success could be measured in communities strengthened rather than profits maximized, while I had shown him that family loyalty could sometimes require holding family members accountable for their harmful actions. The final chapter of our story was still being written through the work we were doing together. Donovan Industries had expanded its mission to include legal advocacy and community organizing as core business functions. We were developing a model that other ethical companies could use to ensure their business practices actively strengthened rather than harmed the communities they served. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that terrible family group chat message, I realized that my parents' dismissive treatment of my relationship had actually created the perfect conditions for exposing their corruption and transforming our community. Their arrogance and contempt had blinded them to the consequences of their actions until it was too late to avoid accountability. The engagement party they had expected to attend, while mocking my absent boyfriend, had instead become the setting for their arrest and public exposure. The family fortune they thought they were protecting had been seized and redistributed to the families they had harmed. The reputation they valued above everything else had been destroyed by their own actions and choices. But perhaps the most poetic justice was that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had found a success more meaningful than anything they had ever achieved. Marcus and I were building something beautiful together, a marriage based on mutual respect and shared values, a business that created rather than destroyed communities, and a legacy of justice that would benefit families for generations to come. Have you ever had family members underestimate you so completely that their dismissal actually created opportunities you never would have had otherwise? Do you think my parents got what they deserved or should? Family loyalty have motivated me to handle this situation differently. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most can be the ones who understand you the least, and that real family is built on respect and shared values rather than just blood relationships. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts about family loyalty versus justice. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for what is right even when it costs you everything. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that their dreams and relationships are valid, regardless of what their family thinks. Thank you for being part of this community where we support each other through the messiest and most challenging parts of life. And remember that the people who truly love you will celebrate your happiness rather than mock your hopes.